hear a story from Scripture as well. We read from the book of Genesis this morning. Abraham and Sarah's child Isaac grew, and he was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for this son of this slave woman shall not inherit, along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered around in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. May these words be to us our light and our life. Thanks be to God. Every family has a storyteller, the one who tells and retells those formative tales so that every generation will carry them forward. Who's the storyteller of their family? Nice. In my family growing up, it was my dad. I remember him teaching us to be aggressive on the softball field and the basketball court by telling a story of pickup football in the backyard, where he ran so fast he launched himself into a parked car, scooping out a chunk of his leg so big he still has a scar. It was a good story. He told another story reminding us of the importance of family. His Grandpa John and Grandma Toots emigrated from Greece and Sweden respectively and opened up a diner in the western suburbs of Chicago. They built a home with their own two hands that stayed in our family until just a couple years ago. I loved hearing these stories from my dad, and for a while I tried to take on the mantle of storyteller for my generation. But I soon found that this task was a lot harder than it looked. Take this story that I tried to tell with my sister recently. When I was in 6th grade, my family traveled to Mexico with my dad's side. They're all avid scuba divers, so they were really excited about a new adventure. I remember arriving exhausted and ready for a nap. We were staying in this big house, and I didn't know which one was going to be my bedroom yet. There was all this family negotiation that still had to happen about who was where. So I was so tired, but I went out into the backyard of the house where the Gulf of Mexico was just there in front of us, and I took some stones and thought I'd pass the time skipping stones into the ocean, seeing what I could do. And instead of passing the time peacefully, I was reprimanded for getting sand in people's eyes, and I was sent into the house where I promptly fell asleep on the couch. So I remember this story feeling like I was being punished, But the rest of the family, as I found from my sister, remembers how surly I was, how badly I treated everyone. I was pouting and throwing things. And they remember that I was doing the best to ruin the first day of our vacation. Was I telling a story of unjust punishment? A story of a family struggling to cope with preteen angst? I guess it depends on your perspective. The book of Genesis is like our first collection of family stories. It's proof that we as human beings have always been storytellers. We've always needed narratives around which to shape our lives and give them meaning. When we hear another person's story, we can't help but empathize with them. Our humanity encounters their humanity, and we both come away transformed. We read two really fascinating stories today. The first, a story of envy, betrayal, and faithfulness, and the second, I think that about covers it too. In our story from Scripture, we find Sarah and Hagar in conflict. A little backstory: Sarah married Abraham, and God promised to make them the parents of many nations. Abraham was to be the patriarch of this new Israelite people, but Sarah was infertile. So God told Abraham to have a child with his slave Hagar. Hagar bore a son, Ishmael, and God's promise was fulfilled. But Sarah was still filled with grief and prayed for a child, and in an unlikely turn of events, she conceived a son in her old age and gave birth to Isaac. But when Isaac took a liking to Hagar's son Ishmael, that was too much for Sarah. She sent Hagar and Ishmael away, not caring whether they lived or died. And God steps in to save the day. Is this a story of infertility and grief giving way to happiness and fulfillment? Is it a story of enslavement and oppression and violence saved by a God who is faithful through all of it? I guess it depends on your perspective. In our contemporary story, Maisie the bird lays an egg, but soon grows bored, lazy as the story goes, and flees to the beach. She leaves her friend Horton to carry the load, which he does triumphantly and with an absurd degree of loyalty, an elephant's faithful 100%. When the egg begins to hatch, Maisie wants her child back, but the baby is born with Horton's features too. After all, he did incubate the little bird elephant, I like calling it a birdophant, for an entire year. We assume Horton goes home with the baby. Is this a story of the great payoff of hard work, commitment, and faithfulness? Is it a story of responsibility and then freedom and then a bit too much freedom and then having everything taken away from you? I guess it depends on your perspective. There is a fallibility in our human storytelling, and that is that we are all only able to speak from our own perspective, our own experience. There is no such thing as an objective story. But what if particularity wasn't the weakness of our stories, but their greatest strength? Feminist theologian Valerie Saving's essay, The Human Situation, A Feminine View, argues that the way we experience God depends on our social location, our gender, our class, the peoples and communities that have shaped us. She points to what had been considered a core theological tenet: the definition of sin as selfishness and salvation as selflessness. And she reflects that this is true if and only if you are free, fully free, to be selfish. In 1960, as she wrote this essay, she was keenly aware of the many ways in which women and other marginalized groups did not have that freedom. So these definitions of sin and salvation that we had long thought of as universal actually particular. But we can't know that unless we listen to people whose experiences are different than ours. Each of us experiences God uniquely, and our own stories are valuable and valid because of what they add to this greater narrative of who God is and who we are as God's people and who God is with us. But we can't stop with our own story. If we did, I would only understand what I see of God from my white, upper middle class, urban, millennial perspective. If that's not a limited perspective, I don't know what is. The great gift of storytelling is that we get to share our own story, but we also get to listen compassionately and openly to the stories of others. We are in a moment as a country where dueling narratives threaten to destabilize us and the values we hold dear. Make no mistake, stories can be weaponized. They can be used to cast groups of people as less than human. They can be used to justify hate. They can be used to pit us against one another. We just have to take a look at this past week, still reeling from the verdict of Officer Yanez's trial, facing the potential loss of health care for millions of the most vulnerable Americans, grappling with the death of Charlena Lyles in Seattle. That's only just the beginning. We've seen stories just this past week dispatched to demonize on each side of these tragedies. But when stories are at their best, they humanize. They remind us that in the beauty of our difference, we share common ground. They remind us that we want many of the same things: safety and security for our families, meaningful work, a loving and supportive community. When we are honest with our own stories and receptive to the stories of others, we remember that we are part of God's great story. Each an integral part of creation, not one of us more or less worthy than any other of God's love. Whether we hurt others because of our own pain, as Sarah did, or whether we are cast out by society and left without hope, as Hagar was, God will keep showing up. And God will keep showing up for our neighbors, too. A week ago, our group returned from the high school mission trip. 12 youth and 3 adults arrived at Johns River Valley Camp, a UCC camp in the mountains not too far from Boone, North Carolina. And immediately there was culture shock. We were one of several churches at camp. There were youth ranging in age from 10 to 19, and all of the other churches were from North Carolina. We discovered that we wore different clothes. One of the things that was noted was here in Minnesota, girls tuck their shirts into their shorts, and in North Carolina, they leave their shirts hanging out. So that was one of the first things we noticed. We noticed we had different kinds of names, and a lot of people from these North Carolina churches had 2 first names, which was awesome and fascinating. We discovered we spoke really differently from one another. We worshiped with very different styles. And I have to admit, my own prejudices came out pretty clearly at first. So, confessional time. I became really defensive of my position as clergy. I was the only female pastor of the 6 ordained people at camp that week. I wrote off some of the adults because of who I assumed they voted for, what policies I assumed they supported, and I have to confess that's sinful. I'm not proud of it. But our amazing youth immediately jumped in and started making friends with these North Carolinians. They told stories of life at home and discovered they shared experiences like high school dances and Snapchat. And they shared deeper stuff too, like family situations and strongly held values. They traded vocabulary. Our youth learned what a 4-point was, and the North Carolinians discovered hot dish. They taught each other camp songs. There was a beautiful night when we took a night hike up to a camp about half a mile up in the mountains, and our youth started singing the songs they knew from Clearwater and taught them to their new friends. It was amazing. They created stories together. They got stuck in canoes over river rapids. They chopped vegetables as quickly as possible to get a meal on the table at a pay-as-you-can restaurant. They tried on goofy clothes as they sorted donations at a thrift store. We shared worship together, and the leadership of all, lay and ordained, youth and adult, male and female, was respected and honored. As we were leaving, I realized our youth had helped me rewrite my predetermined narratives. Praise music doesn't mean oppressive theology. A Southern accent doesn't indicate anything about a person's politics. And our surface level differences didn't matter that much anymore. It mattered that we were children of God, wanting the best for one another and for each other's communities. I don't pretend to know the way forward for our country. As an urban, white, upper middle class millennial, I believe I am uniquely unqualified to make any kind of assessment there. But I do know that we, as people of faith, are called to rewrite our narratives, remembering that each and every person is a beloved child of God. God's faithfulness extends to everyone in our human family, no exceptions. Horton sat on that egg, even after he was threatened by hunters, dumped on by thunderstorms, and carried around from circus to circus. And in the end, that little nugget still looked like a bird, still had wings, but it had Horton's trunk and tail. Just as Horton's ridiculous faithfulness and radical empathy couldn't help but have an impact on that little birdiphant, so too God's ridiculous faithfulness and radical empathy imprints on us. With all that love coming our way, we can't help but take it on. Friends, are we writing a story of death and despair, of hopelessness and division? Or are we writing a story of faith, hope, and love strong enough to transcend the pain in our world? I guess it depends on your perspective. Amen.